most of them out here with a video about gunpowder units and line of sight in update 3.0. A lot of people have been asking me about it, especially since the Chaos Dwarfs use a lot of gunpowder units. So I've just quickly put together a bunch of tests that will hopefully give us a good idea of how gunpowder units are performing in 3.0. For most of the tests, I'm using Chaos Dwarf Infernal Guard or Longbeards, specifically using them because they're durable, shielded, slow moving, and short. I'm intentionally using dwarfs because they are short, so they should make any potential line of sight issues due to hills or rises worse. So bear in mind that if you're firing at monstrous units or even just taller infantry like Chaos Warriors, you're probably going to have an easier time getting line of sight. In the interest of saving time, I'm just running through these tests very quickly. These are just a variety of situations that people have mentioned can be problematic. I haven't tested each thing exhaustively. We're just going to sort of touch on each thing quickly. First up, we've got rattling guns trying to fire over mounds in the underway battles. Rattling guns have a very flat trajectory to their missiles. You can see these ones are set back just enough to be able to fire over this mound. But if I move them closer to the mound, they can't shoot over it. Pull them back a little bit, then they can shoot over it again. Weapons teams firing over the rubble through destroyed walls. The Warplock Jezzails and the Rattling Gunners seem to be able to fire over the mounds or even through the mounds. The rise of the wall rubble mound doesn't seem to block their line of sight. These Rattling Gunners may have been obstructed by the slope behind the walls that the Infernal Guard are coming up. Also, I think that a certain number of the unit maybe needs to be able to get line of sight. And it could be that the narrow opening is stopping them from getting line of sight in this unit until they get quite close. But once they're close enough that most of the unit can get an angle, they open fire and then the rubble mound doesn't seem to be blocking. They can shoot straight through it. Gunpowder units firing from docked positions on walls. When the enemy's quite far away and the trajectory is still pretty flat, most of the units seem to fire. But as the enemy gets close to the walls, less of your troops seem to fire, and once they get very close to the walls, your gunners don't shoot at all. There is a realistic line of sight issue here, but I think in a real fight, the troops at the back would be reloading and handing forward their guns so that the trooper at the front could lean over and shoot down. They shouldn't really lose that much rate of fire. The easiest way to represent this might be just to let them shoot through the ground. Here we have some troops on a raised platform behind some wall crenellations, but they're not docked, they're just standing there. As long as the elevation is pretty flat, they seem to fire pretty well. Maybe not every trooper is firing, but similar to the troops that were docked on the walls when they were firing at range. And firing completely flat on the same elevation as their target, the crenellations don't seem to block them at all. They can do just as much damage as a normal unobstructed unit. Weirdly, these crenellations that look quite similar totally block line of sight. Can't shoot through them at all. Not sure if that's intentional. It may be due to the height of them. They look a little bit higher. Some people have reported line of sight being obstructed by decorative items like these fences and tents and stuff that actually aren't really there, that your units can move freely through. I tested a couple of different decorative fences. None of them seem to obstruct my fire, but it's likely that it's the sort of thing that only happens on certain maps from certain angles and might be really hard to reproduce. It doesn't seem to be happening in 3.0 as far as I can tell, but I haven't done anywhere near enough testing to know definitively. Gunpowder line of sight in open ground where there's slight elevations and dips in the terrain. Here I've just set up a straight line of handgunners on a slight rise so that most of them should be able to get line of sight most of the time down this hill. The slight arc on these handgunners is allowing them to shoot over the less extreme bumps, although the units in the middle, directly behind that little hump, can't get line of sight. As the Longbeards get closer to our hill, we lose line of sight on the near side. Only the couple of units in the distance there that are on the flatter ground are still firing. Even as the Longbeards kind of crest that rise and are really close, and it seems like they should definitely be able to fire, there's maybe still a slight elevation difference, or perhaps that decorative fence is blocking line of sight. For whatever reason, there's not much firing going on, especially on this near side. Now, this is the same battle, but I've tried to place all of my gunpowder units on extra raised platforms to make sure they have as much line of sight as possible, and they can definitely see over any of those small bumps in the terrain. When these Longbeards go into this deep dip, clearly behind that little hill, probably we don't have line of sight right then, but we're able to fire over all of those minor little ripples in the terrain because that little bit of extra elevation. Basically, the entire gun line is firing almost the entire time just due to the better placement, except for when they're completely behind that hill. Although the fire doesn't seem that effective, all of our guns are firing to full effect. It's just that these are silver shielded Longbeards, so they are quite durable. Here we have the same terrain again for a third time. This time we've got a few greatswords to throw in there to tank and make the battle a little bit more stationary so we can zoom in and have a look at some of the line of sight on different handgunner units. Although archers would have no problem shooting like this, you can see when you get down to ground level, these handgunners don't have line of sight over these bumps in the terrain. With the Longbeards pinned by our greatswords, we can shift our handgunners around to get some better angles. You can see here, these handgunners are shooting over a slight curve in the terrain, but they're still able to get line of sight, as you would expect. This unit looks like it has line of sight, but only a couple of units are firing. Then when I target the enemy, and the unit realigns itself, and then it's suddenly completely unobstructed, even though the unit barely moved. This unit's also obstructed, so I target the enemy unit so that they'll move forward until they have a line of sight. Although only about half the ranks at the front are actually firing, the back ranks are still obstructed by the hill. Although if I had them in a wider formation with less ranks like you would in multiplayer, then that distance the AI selected would probably allow all of them to shoot. This is much better positioning. Wider formation, less ranks, with the depression directly in front of the unit so that absolutely nothing can obstruct their line of sight. The enemy unit's pinned and we're firing down their flank. I've got to say, I'm not really sure if anything has really changed with the way the line of sight works. Still seems about the same to me. Just in the testing I was doing today, I didn't really come across anything too bad. Everything sort of worked roughly as I expected in most situations. There definitely are some things you need to watch out for when you're using gunpowder units, and you definitely do have to babysit them and watch those lines of sight all the time. But I must say the gunpowder units, especially the blunderbuss units for the Chaos Dwarfs, are extremely satisfying to use. One thing to note about them is because they're extremely short range, there's much less opportunity for the line of sight to get obstructed. And because their damage is so extreme, they don't need line of sight for as long in order to do their damage. You can see the difference here with the sheer amount of carnage that 7 blunderbusses are doing compared to the 7 Empire handgunners. These are the same silver shielded Longbeards that completely tanked the Empire handgunners, but they come up short against the Chaos Dwarf shotgun stack. And that concludes this video on the most powerful law of magic, the law of gunpowder.